Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of In the Prog Seat. It's Tuesday night. We're talking prog metal tonight. You guys have asked for it, a whole episode on progressive metal. We're going to stick to the 90s in this particular show. Let me introduce the crew. We got a very special guest tonight, the creator of this very cool festival that's been going on for a long time now called ProgPower. Glenn Harveston is in the house on In the Prog Seat. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. And of course, we've got Ken Golden, the professor of prog metal, and George Lemie, king of fusion and prog metal, here with us as well tonight. So, hello, gentlemen. You
Hey,
guys ready to talk some 90s prog metal? Some folks may be asking, well, why are we doing 90s? Well, there's a reason why. So, this thing called progressive metal really didn't start to take off until the 90s. And of course, it was precursored. Is that a word, precursored? By bands like Fate's Warning and maybe early Queensryche, and certainly Dream Theater right at the end of the decade. You can go all the way back to Rush, right? And so the Watchtower, plenty of bands that kind of popped up in the 80s. We weren't necessarily calling anything progressive metal then. Of course, with Dream Theater's Images and Words kind of became a thing. All of a sudden, you got bands popping up all over creation doing this sort of heavy metal meets progressive rock type of thing with instrumental virtuosity and soaring melodic vocal hooks and choruses and things like that, right? But the 90s is really where it all started to happen. And what we've been kind of throwing around for a while is figuring out, well, how do we kind of like talk about this whole movement in the 90s and really kind of capture what it was all about? And in doing so, you really have to kind of look deep. Yeah, there were some bigger players during the scene, but after Dream Theater and Fate's Warning and Queensryche, you had all these other bands popping up. Some of them fell by the wayside, some of them are still around to this day. And some really, really cool bands across a lot of different labels coming from a lot of different countries. But it took a while for this to really kind of kick off and start to get on people's radars. So we're going to talk first before we get into our 10 albums each that we picked. We've each picked 10 albums that are highlights for us for the decade. Let's talk a little bit about kind of how this all started specifically in the underground and at a time where this is just prior to the internet, right at the beginning of the internet age. So it's not like you can go and surf 10 million websites and things like that and find all this stuff. You had to find it other ways, and the word started to get out. So, you know, I think Ken and Glenn here are both very, very integral to this whole movement, kind of starting from kind of two different places here. So, Ken, maybe you can kind of start us all off as
sure.
someone who has done the mail order thing for quite a long time, and he's got a cool catalog or maybe a few catalogs to
Yeah, well,
show.
well, you guys are gonna see them backwards. So back in the day, before I had a website, before there were websites, and before there were shopping carts, we did mail order. Everybody did mail order, and we used to do things. Apologies, this is backwards. That's the Dan Prezi thing. But we used to do these. Used to do these really cool catalogs, and I would write the damn thing. Take me forever. My wife used to hate me because I used to take all my time doing it. And around 90, I didn't know anything about prog metal. And then around 95, I started selling Arion, the Final Experiment. And a lot of the guys who were buying prog rock from me were really interested in it. And they were buying the Arion disc. And then I said, look, what else do you guys want me to bring in? Because I have access to all this. There was a German distributor that I was working with called Hart. I don't know if Hart's still in business. And they had like an actual catalog and they had everything listed in there. And I didn't know any of these bands. Glenn became a customer of mine. There was a whole bunch of guys who became customers, regulars, and they would tell me what to bring in. And then I'd start throwing bands at them. And I started developing clientele for it. Finally, in 97, this was the fall 97 catalog. This was the real full blown, they had a separate prog metal section. And what happened was, which was kind of funny, was I, again, I didn't know these bands. There was another company out of Indianapolis called Dream Disc. George, do you remember Dream Disc?
Yeah, that was a customer.
Glenn, were you a customer?
For a few times, but they
Pete,
suck.
I don't know if you knew them. So they were a mail order company. They put out a catalog, and those guys were really expensive. I mean, they would get CDs and they would charge like $21 for a C just even CD. And I'd look it up and I'm like, I could sell this thing for $15. So I just started, I became a Dream Disc customer and I just started bringing in the stuff that was of interest. That's how I discovered these bands. And then, Glenn and would tell me, what he was looking for. And we had another friend, Larry Daglieri, Larry D, would would mention it, mention some bands, Eric Welty. Glenn could tell you a bunch of other guys, and some of these guys are still around. Some of them, who knows where they are. And then we used to chat. You remember the old AOL chat rooms?
Yeah.
We right? I think we had a. There was a. I'm pretty sure that we were in a prog metal group there. There were the old message boards like Rec Music, whatever. Is that Glenn? Was that
No,
where Perpetual Motion started?
no, we actually started before that in the old IRC chat room
ICQ.
waiting rooms. That's where
I,
we
I,
started with.
ICQ, right?
Not ICQ, IRC. This was before
Oh,
internet.
I don't even
So
remember that.
yeah, this is
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So that's, I think, really sort of the foundation of this scene, this exchange of bands and ideas was going back and forth. So then there was a festival called Power Mad. And the Power Mad Festival was put together by Keith Menzer from the band Mystic Force. And it was in an American Legion Hall in a strip mall in Towson, Maryland, right next to Baltimore. And it was a phenomenal festival that was so poorly run that it was incomprehensible. And like 100 people would show up, and we would see bands that in our dreams we would never think we would see. We saw Maya Dome. I mean, Maya Dome came over
Wow.
from Sweden, right? Glenn, who else was there? I mean, it was crazy,
We had Evergrey.
right? Evergrey play. I mean, it was like all these bands would come over, and Ice Age played there. I mean, we had a blast, and part of the reason why we had a blast was it was so inept. That one of the highlights was we're eating the sausage sandwiches, from the food truck outside, and I think that Glenn, isn't that what really spurred you to do Prog Power?
Well, we were all sitting around drinking at the food truck. Then we went out to dinner. Yeah, we actually were at a seafood restaurant. And bottom line is, one of the there was a band called Ion Vane that played the fest,
From
and,
Chicago.
and yeah, from Chicago, and he was laughing, Chris Lotesto, and he was laughing and making fun of it. And he's basically, I said, "Yeah, I can do a better job than this." And he said, "Well, if you can, I know a bar back in Chicago. They'll let you do it for free. You give them the whole bar." And it just kind of started from there.
So the first Frog Power was in a bar called J.J. Kelly's, right?
It was.
And Glenn, why don't you tell us who played at the first, if it's in basically a bar? Tell us who played there.
Yeah, it was a bar, and the stage. When I had never been to that bar before, it was sub-zero outside. I walk in, and the stage was about 10, 12 inches tall at the most.
Just off the
I
floor.
mean, I was mortified when I walked in there. They had tiles in the ceiling, and it rained, and you could see it drip down, the stains and everything in there. Um, it was great. We pushed all the chairs and stuff to the back of the room and loaded in there. I had bands like Symphony X, Pain of Salvation, Evergrey. Hell, I don't
Euro
even
Hour.
Zero Hour. I had Power of Omens back in the day. I mean, I had everybody that was popular on the forums came to play it.
Yeah.
It was
And,
going
and,
on.
and the room was pretty packed, right?
Oh, it was sold out. We sold it out, 300 people. And in the back, I remember standing on chairs with Ray Alder. We were sitting there watching the show while we had to stand on chairs to see.
And I remember Pain of Salvation. Didn't they have to travel like 24 hours going
They
through
did.
Iceland?
They got stuck in the airport actually in Maryland, and I went and picked them up at like 5 in the morning or so, or Jim Patulski, and took them to McDonald's, and then they crashed for like 6 hours before they could play. It was a nightmare, but and it was one of the best sets I've ever seen too. from pain and suffering.
All these bands were incredible.
It was legendary.
George, were you there?
Yeah. The ceiling was so low above the stage that when Tom was spinning his head, headbanging, the hair got caught in the ceiling tiles.
It was it was epic.
Legendary show, folks.
And I remember I couldn't get home because there was an ice storm in New Jersey. I couldn't fly into Newark. So, or Philly, wherever I was, Philly. I couldn't fly into Philly. So I had to spend the night at a hotel at the airport. And I was able to come in the next day. Yeah, that was great. But yeah, so anyway, so that's sort of how this whole thing kind of developed. And then once we started getting, the internet and then forums and stuff, it just kind of expanded. And perhaps somebody will comment and they'll have a different perspective on how this thing happened. But I think that we could kind of take credit for some of this at least. And if you wanted prog metal, where would you get it? Dream Disc? Yeah, maybe. You came to me and you got it from me.
Yeah, I mean, I was ordering from you. I was getting a little bit from Greg Walker at Symphonic. I don't know if you remember CD Treasures. My friend Greg Blair had this company called CD Treasures from Boise, Idaho for a while. He was selling lots of prog metal, so that's how you got it. You call up on the phone, be like, "Yeah, I got your catalog. I want this, this, and that. How much do I owe you?" Send them a check, credit card over the phone, and a couple days later, there comes the box. That's it.
I used to have shops they used to subscribe to my catalog so they could know what to bring into their store. So yeah, I mean, it was great just reviewing this catalog. I was seeing bands listed here. Time has forgotten some of these bands. I mean, it's I don't want to mention them because they may pop up in our discussion. So,
Yeah, and it's funny because I'm trying to remember exactly when we started calling it progressive metal because I mean, George, you were probably listening to Fate's Warning in the 80s like me. We weren't calling it prog metal back then.
No,
Just
never heard
metal.
that.
It was just US
Yeah.
metal. I mean,
I
um,
think Images and Words time, I think,
I
is
think
about when.
basically, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you started to see like the Dream Theater clones and Magna Carta came up and popping up so yeah, it kind of blew up from there and you started seeing bands all over the world kind of doing this thing. So yeah, so that's kind of like a little bit of history on how this all started and really started to gain steam in the 90s. And like we said, Glenn, of course, has been kind of manning the ship for this style of music for many, many, many years with ProgPower. And you've got it's coming to an end soon, right, Glenn?
2 years. I got one more already announced, and then my last one will be 25.
What's a long run? Nothing lasts forever, right? But it's just amazing how so many people, just like kind of like with any festival, especially here in the States, that has run for a number of years, you just get people who want to come back year in and year out, regardless of what the lineup is. And it's just been a great chance for a lot of international bands to come here and play in front of American audiences, even if it's just for the one show. So what we've done is we've picked out 10 of our favorites from the 90s, and not including the big boys. So there's no Dream Theater, there's no Fates Warning, no Queensryche on these lists, but anybody else was up for grabs in 1990 to 1999. So what we're going to do is we're each going to give 3 picks in a row, and for each turn, we'll go around a few times, and we'll start off with our guest here, Glenn, to tell us about his first 3 choices.
I'm going with the first one. Psychotic Waltz, Social Grace. This was the original prog hippie metal as far as I was concerned. It was jarring at the time, but not too over the top extreme. But it wasn't something you could just tap your fingers to. And Buddy Lackey, it was the metal Jethro Tull at the time. And he would dance around with the flute on the stage, and he made the flute cool. That's my first pick, and I think that was one of the earliest ones of the 90s as well.
1990, yeah.
Yeah, that was my number one. Number two, I apologize for the cover, but the silver. This is called. I know it's hard to see. I know it's Vox DeVille is the name.
Wow, I remember that. Yeah,
prog band from Australia. The album is To Dimension Logic, and they had possibly the most cold album you'll ever hear for prog metal. You've heard the warm melodies, but not these guys. They were cold, they were atmospheric, very thick. Fate's Warning almost, but almost like a dark side of Fate's Warning. But they did have the melodies, but that atmosphere, you could just cut it with a knife. So we were big fans, and that caught on like wildfire back on the forum called the used to be Perpetual Motion forum at the time, and that was a big hit on there. And then I'm just going to go ahead and get this one out of the way because you can't do prog 90s without this one. This is the masterpiece, The Divine Wings of Tragedy. I really needs no introduction. It was basically Kansas on steroids with a lot of Dio singing at times and everything like that. So not really much of an introduction needed on that, but this is the quintessential 90s prog metal album.
Yeah, you got to have Symphony X on this list. Absolutely.
I saw, I think it was their first show that they ever did in the US. It was in the back of a motorcycle shop.
Yep, I was there.
You were there, right?
Yep, Mastermind opened up, if I remember correctly, right?
Mastermind opened, yeah. And the stage, there was no stage. The stage wasn't delivered. So the band was on the same level as the audience. And basically, like the only time I could see Russell Allen was when he would hold the microphone over his head. I could see like from here on up, you know. And I saw Mike Piniella because he was on like a little. They made like a little riser for him, so I could see him playing keyboards. I don't think I saw too much of Romeo, you know, about my.
That was the weirdest show ever. Such a strange place. I remember we walked in and we're like, "This is where the show is."
Yeah.
What is this?
Yeah. It was, yeah. But yeah, but you know, but like we said, I had guys coming up to me in the lobby because they were all customers, you know. That's how we found. How else did you find out about this stuff, you know? Yeah.
But they started picking up speed on the East Coast pretty quickly after that because I think I saw them about maybe a year later opening up for Blind Guardian at that other place in New Jersey that was right around the corner, not too far from Starland Ballroom. The name is escaping me right now. Birch Hill. Birch Hill.
Yeah, Birch Hill.
Hill, yeah.
So Symphony X. So here was the thing. Going back to Power Man, as I said, it was a great festival. But Keith Menzer, who passed away, rest in peace, Keith. He had the ambition, but he just didn't know how to put all the pieces together. So he would announce bands as being on the lineup, except there was one problem: he didn't invite them. And Symphony X was one of those bands. And I remember talking to Mike Romeo about it. He was getting hate mail because they didn't show up to play. And he said he never asked us. You know, he was using it. He said if he would have just paid for our van, we would have gotten on the Jersey Turnpike and come down. He didn't even ask us.
Yeah, that's not the way to do it.
No, but that was the way Keith kind of did things. So you know, it's funny.
All right, Ken, your first three choices.
All right. So, by the way, I just mentioned all those plaques that Glenn has. He has a guy whittling those things. So
it's nice.
Yeah. All right. So, I didn't have vaudeville on my list because I couldn't explain vaudeville. Vaudeville was beyond my comprehension. I love the band, but I couldn't explain it. All right. Let me open up Prezi. Let's go. Cynic, Focus. We're going to get some of the bigger boys out of the way. So Cynic was a futuristic metal band. They kind of evolved out of the Tampa Bay death metal scene. Paul Masvidal and I guess it was Sean Reiner were both in the band Death. And there's some Death vocals. Paul used to use a vocoder to sing through, and that was kind of hit or miss. Some people thought it was okay. Some people hated it. But it was one of the elements to set the band apart. They had this amazing rhythm section that were nicknamed the Two Seans. You had Sean Malone on fretless bass and Chapman stick, and you had Sean Reiner on drums. Phenomenal rhythm section. The two guitarists, Paul Masvidal and Jason Goebel, these guys were shredding away. They were playing guitar synthesizer. You had Tony Teagarden playing keyboards, and he did all the Death vocals. The music had a very strong fusion influence, but you know, they were basically a technical death metal band. From my perspective, nothing sounded anything like them before them, and after that, they were clearly influential on a lot of bands. But Cynic, Focus, the debut, I think is kind of I would say a bit of a unique album. They did, when they reformed, they made some very solid music, but there was something very special, I think, about Focus. And that's my first. Next one, and getting some of the more popular ones out of the way. So don't worry, you guys will be digging by the end of the night. So, Pain of Salvation, Entropia, their first album, and it might not be their best album of the '90s, but it's my favorite. I had a little bit of a backstory with this particular album because my distributor in Japan at the time was Marquee, and they were distributing this Pain of Salvation album called Entropia, prog metal. I was selling prog metal. Hey, what is it? I check it out. They send me copies. This thing's phenomenal. Well, make a long story short, I sold about 300 copies of this album. And then it came out, then it got licensed to Inside Out for Europe, and they signed with Inside Out. This particular album, I think, is very different from all their other albums. Somehow they managed to fuse Faith No More with Dream Theater. It's got like a little bit of a funk feel to it. Daniel Gildenlow, who's the leader of the band, there was another Daniel in the band for the first album, Daniel Magdick, and he co-wrote a lot of the material and he played guitar. And I think he might have been the magic element because once he was gone, their sound became a little more traditional prog metal, what we know as prog metal. One Hour by the Concrete Lake, Remedy Lane, fantastic albums. They had that clunker called B, which I think is just absolutely unlistenable. I could tell Pete, you're thinking it. You're thinking. You don't want to say it, but you're thinking it.
It's not one of my favorites. No, it's not.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
So yeah, I like the album. I think it's quite different. It's different. I think it's not just different from the rest of their catalog, but I think it's different from anybody else's. Prove me wrong. It's my favorite. Next one, I'll get the big gun out of the way. Spiral Architect, Skeptic's Universe. So this was one of the bands that I decided to launch the Sensory label with. I have a long history with this record. I was in the studio down in Texas when they were recording it. Norwegian band came over from Norway to record. Very influenced by Watchtower and Cynic and jazz rock. They're very, very technical music. Lars Norberg, the bass player, his bass work is it's very pronounced in the mix, which is a bit unusual. There's just this incredible energy, constantly shifting time signatures. The guitar player, Steinar Gunderson, one of the most incredible guitarists I've ever watched play. Glenn, you had them at ProgPower.
I did.
They got sabotaged by the sound guy, and I have the soundboard. I have a DAT of the soundboard of that show, and the only problem is that Steinar's guitar is kind of missing. So, Asgear, if you're watching this and you want to do something with it, like have Steinar overdub guitar parts, I have the DAT here. So, otherwise, so those are my first three.
And spoiler alert, I did not pick that album because it came out here in January and Japan in December, so I didn't pick it.
Same for me.
Yeah.
When did I put it? Well, yeah, I put it out in Japan. It came out in Japan. We started recording that thing in '97. So,
But it's a landmark from this time period, so yeah.
yeah, all right. If you want to discount it, I'll pick something else.
That's okay. It's all right.
I didn't pick it because I knew you would.
Yeah, well, actually, I thought we all would pick it. I mean, was it 90?
It's the first one I thought of, but then I was like, it's kind of like it's 2000, so I was like, whatever. But
I don't know. I don't know why. I don't know why we bumped it into 2000. But,
It's just over the line. Like,
yeah,
must have been. I must have done it like January.
yeah.
I think it
January
was like. I think it was like December '99 or something like that in Japan.
December.
Nice.
Wikipedia says December 16th, so right before the holiday.
Yeah. All right.
It's all right.
Mea culpa.
No, it's all right. George, your first three.
Well, this one's been called already, but I gotta agree with Glenn. Psychotic Waltz. Yeah, coming out of the 80s, there is no prog metal scene. The big records that I had in 89 were the Dream Theater, the Watchtower, and Toxic Think This. Those were like a beginning of something I thought. Watchtower wasn't going to do anything for years and years after that, and Toxic really never did until they came back, and now they're pretty much straight thrash. But I was reading a local magazine called CAM, Chicago Area Metal Monthly, and it was a review of the Psychotic Waltz, and she said it was a mixture of Dream Theater and Watchtower, which it actually doesn't sound like either one of them.
No.
But I wrote into her about where to get it, and she's like, "I'll send you my copy." I didn't like it, so she sent me the copy, and I was like blown away. It's so fresh and inventive. Buddy Lackey at the time, man, his melodies just they killed me, and the music, the mix of like Sabbath and prog stuff and Tall, just fell in love with it, and just started collecting them after that. But I think they're essential for the fact that there's no keyboards. Like everybody would get cloney after images and words, and keyboards would be mandatory. They have just like decorative keyboards. And because of how early it is, I think it's essential 90s prog metal. I should mention I'm going in chronological order because we all decided we weren't going to put them in numerical order. Next one's a little obscure, Auditory Imagery, So Alive. This is a East Coast band. I was going to record shows at the time. The Dream Disc guys, that's where I met them. They used to do these record shows here. And this was a band that a dealer, he knew what I liked, and he's like, "You got to check this out." I said, well, at the time, I'm sick of all these Dream Theater clones that are starting to appear. And he's like, "No, no, this is more in Fate's Warning camp, which you don't hear." So I grabbed it, and sure enough, that's kind of where it comes from. Singer's got a unique voice, really cool. They're not about virtuosity. Nobody really rips in this band, but they just write really good tunes, and highly recommended if you're a big fan of the Fates Warning type prog metal. And then again, I got to repeat this one. Uh, you know, I was in from the beginning. A guitarist was in a thing called the Guitarist Network, which is like a pre-internet, like snail mail thing for guitar players. So we were in from the solo album, Dark Chapter. You start listening to the albums and getting the steps of how they're getting better. Production's getting better, songs are getting better. But when this came out, it was a leap forward. Um, it was like the first band that I heard that could match Dream Theater for having the whole package: production, songs, virtuosity, individual personalities. So, I mean, when this came out, tail end of 96, I was blown away. It was like just a whole nother thing. I think I drove up to Impulse to get this. Because at this time they only had a Japanese label. They didn't get signed in America till in between. So this was it. So yeah, for me, this is still actually most of these have held up for me. I picked them all because of the way they hit me then, but this holds up for me. This is a very, very high record for me. And it's still my favorite from them to this day. So I had to pick it.
Georgia, I tried to release that album, so uh, it
It's been
was
good.
it, it was out in Japan,
Yeah.
and I think Inside Out had already put it out, but you couldn't get the album over here,
Yeah.
and it was really difficult. So I was talking to Mike Romeo about it, and I said, I think I'm going to try and license this, and he was encouraging me to do it, and I contacted Zero Corporation Japan, which was owned by Toshiba, and they gave me a very polite "fuck you, go away" letter, and I did not, as is well documented, I did not release any Symphony X albums.
Before I go on, I know it's a week, gonna be a little over a week after the game happened, but I want to wish my congratulations to my New York Mets, who just made it into the playoffs just a little while ago.
I live in Atlanta. Sorry.
Well, Atlanta just won the second game, so they're both in. So yeah,
Oh, I didn't even know. Thank you.
yeah. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. A lot can happen in a week. So by the time this episode airs, both of our teams could be out of it. Who knows? Hopefully
I have
not. So
no
we'll see.
idea. All right. Thank you.
So yeah, so I just wanted to do that. Anyway, yeah, let me get three out of the way that already have been mentioned, but they're mandatory picks for me. Yeah, absolutely, the Symphony X. At the time, I was a massive Dream Theater fan. I mean, Dream Theater just became pretty much my world when Images and Words came out, and I was just so into them. And then, I got wind of this band from New Jersey that was only releasing their albums in Japan, and they were must hear. And I don't remember where or who told me about Symphony X. I don't remember, but I spent like big bucks at the time to get this import CD. And like George said, I was absolutely blown away by this because you're right. It had a lot of individuality and powerful songwriting, amazing instrumental brilliance, and a killer singer. And it, like I think Glenn might have mentioned, like it was like Kansas on steroids. But they were very different from Dream Theater. They didn't sound anything like Dream Theater. You could tell like Romeo had a lot of that neoclassical thing going on, and just so many great songs on here. The big riffs, the powerful production, the amazing guitar solos and keyboards, and that voice. I remember the first time I heard the epic 20-minute title track, I was like, it was just so good. And when Russell Allen just kicked it up a notch, like in the middle of the song, you're like, holy shit, that's like Dio. It's like what's going on here? Just so good. And then I started seeing them. Before you know it, they got you were able to get their follow-up albums here in the States and whatnot. But yeah, they became kind of like they at the time might have even overtaken Dream Theater for me as my favorite band of that era. And I still, and to me, they just kept getting better and better and better. And while I think there's a couple of Symphony X albums that I like maybe a tiny bit more to this day, I still have a real fond spot for this one. So yeah, got to pick that. The Psychotic Waltz, 100%. So I only ever got Bleeding during the time when they were a band, and I never picked up any of the other albums. Don't know, don't ask me why. And Ken, I believe I got Bleeding from you like a million years ago, and I just never got the rest of the catalog. And then it was all out of print. And then when I heard that they were reissuing these recently, I scooped all of them up. And so I really only just heard this album in its entirety, like for the first time, real recently. This is phenomenal for a first album at this time in 1990. So good, so different. I mean, and The Devil Cried, Halo of Thorns, just killer songs. Really intricate, crushing riffs and just weird time signatures and those great vocals. It's proggy, it's metal, it's like it's a little psychedelic and weird. And I just think it's absolutely amazing. And this band is still to this day, I think, so unique. And they're, totally different from all the other bands that came before them and after them, which I think is really, really cool. So yeah, Social Grace has to be on this list. And then I got to go with Cynic, Flow. Yeah, again, another really weird, different album. And if you take out the death metal growls that's on, a good chunk of the album, it's not a death metal album at all, other than that. And I don't even know if the growls were really needed. I mean, they came out from the Florida scene alongside like Death and a whole handful of other bands, right? Morbid Angel and so on and so forth. But they don't sound anything like them. The weird vocoder is kind of sci-fi-ish and bizarre. But the music is like prog and fusion and just it's like not like anything else that came out around this time. And I think, they basically broke up after this album and then they came back like a million years later with their follow-up. And I think they tried very hard to capture some of the things they were doing on this album, but they had already like moved past this kind of music. But they did it to recapture the old fans, which I think was weird. So the second album has little elements of the vocoder and little elements of the death metal stuff, but the growls. But musically, they were moving on into different directions already. But just really intricate, complex stuff, and just so out there for the time. Great musicianship. I mean, the guitars are just amazing. The bass and the drums are just off the charts good. And so for folks watching who maybe don't like, extreme metal or death metal growls, I would say give this a try because the music is just unlike anything you've ever heard. Really, really good. So yeah, those are my first three. Back to Glenn.
I'm going to tack on one thing on that Psychotic Waltz. They had 4 releases, and all 4 had totally different vibes for me.
Yeah.
100%. Yep.
Completely
Absolutely.
different.
That was what made the band fantastic.
And I think the newest album, the fifth album, I think was really good too.
I agree. Yeah.
Shape boy. What do you got, Glenn?
Yeah. What do you got?
Devin Townsend, Ocean Machine, Biomech. This was the absolute first time I've ever heard a wall of sound come out of my speakers. His production style for this. It was overwhelming. It sounded like nothing I'd heard before in terms of just, it wasn't industrial, but it was just amazingly, it just smacked my damn face around is all it did. And then you had all, Devin's vocal melodies. This is still remains my favorite Devin album, just simply because of how powerful this one is. I mean, just Seventh Wave Life, just amazing. And this is the one thing that I regret that I did not got the ProgPower yet. It's in to play this damn thing, and I'm still at it though. So absolutely quintessential. And then everybody remembers Dream Theater, Images and Word, and we all started chasing the dragon after that. We wanted the next Dream Theater. I did. I couldn't get enough of the sound because they were the only ones making it. So there was nothing else in the States, so we ran overseas for one of the best Dream Theater sound-alike albums ever made. Von and Bloss, The God Thing, from the opening of Fire Blossom, which is one of the greatest opening instrumentals ever, straight into Rainmaker. It was pure Dream Theater, except for the vocals where Andy Kuntz was a little bit more of that Broadway style. He had a big old range. Not for everybody. He's a little bit of an acquired taste with his tone, but still, the musicians on this is as close to Dream Theater as you're going to get back in the day. And then my other one, let me differentiate two things because we have the age-old argument. Prog is a genre where it's all wanky and stuff, and then prog is in progressive, where we move on things we've not heard before. They push the envelope. So I'm going to go into the other realm, and you're going to laugh, Ken, but back in the day, nothing sounded like this. Evergreen, Solitude, Dominance, Tragedy. They blended the Gothic style, heavy, but then they threw in all types of changes throughout. There was narration, signature, time changes, crunch, everything. And there was just nothing else like it. And it's still to this day, it's a powerful album. Especially, The Shocking Truth, Going Into a Scattered Me. It's just when you listen to these lyrics, they're pretty hit you right in the fucking face is what they do. And
Their lyrics?
today, they still remain one of my all-time favorite bands.
Glenn, you're not wrong. I mean, I was talking to Pete about this the other day. Originally I had Dark Discovery on my list. When I was listening to it, the production was so bad. I just and then it was really, really murky. But Solitude, Dominance, Tragedy, I think was a great record. Great record. It's not a bad choice. It's a problem. I have like 20 on my top 10. So
many. So many.
Well, we'll save them for part 2 or 3,
There you go.
All right. Let me see what I got here. So now it's starting to get a little obscure. Charisma, 1825. So this was a Danish band. And Glenn and I, we have his friend Larry Daglieri, Larry D. Larry is pretty well known in the prog metal community. And Larry loved this album. I used to sell this record, and Larry loved it, and I didn't understand it. And then one day, I'm driving on the Jersey Turnpike. I'm going to Jersey City, and I'm getting off like exit 14A, I think it was, right at the ramp. And all of a sudden, I'm listening to this record, and the damn thing just like clicked with me. I just remember it just so well. It's a concept album about a woman whose father wouldn't let her get married, so she plots with her boyfriend or lover to kill off her dad. I don't even remember this, but I was in doing a little background. I dug up Larry's old review that he did for progressiveworld.net, and this is extensive essay on this album. It's got just a lot of hooks. It's very melodic. It's got more hooks than I think any other prog metal album I could think of. And it just clicked right away. The opening track, Marriage of Convenience. It's very hard to compare this band to anybody else. They got this crunchy guitar riffs, lots of keyboard works, lots of synthesizers, just a bit different from the rest. And it's long out of print, but you could hear it on you could actually hear it on Spotify. It's really cool. They had other albums, but as far as I know, this was the one. Next, Divine Wings of Tragedy. I mean, this is the one. I mean, who is a better singer than Russell Allen? No one, right? So this was their third album. Russell joined on the second album. The first one, Damnation Game, good album, but I like Damnation Game a lot. But Divine Wings of Tragedy, it's stepped up to the next level. Yeah, just incredible musicianship. We talked about Michael Romeo, great neoclassical guitar. There goes my ring again. You got Mike Piniella on keyboards. I mean, he's going toe to toe with Romeo. You got some of their best tracks that their classics, the Accolade and the title track, 21-minute title track. They're epics, and it's got everything. The band's got this bombast to them that I just love. I like shit. Well, prog rock, prog metal. I don't care what it is, man. If you go over the top, if you go totally bombastic, you got me. So, and then I go a little more obscure, and I've spoken about this band in the past, and I turned a lot of people onto this band. Gone, Weakness Within Living Memory. Came out in '97, and there were all these bands popping up all over the place, and we discovered this band. Uh, they were just a one and done band. It's very dark. It's a lot of melancholy. It's very atmospheric driven. There's no speed or anything like that, but there's like really cool synthesizer runs, some nice heavy guitar crunch. The lead singer is kind of strange. This guy named Martin Simon. He has this sings in like an upper register. He reminds me of Roger Hodgson of Supertramp. It's kind of a little weird, and that's probably a terrible comparison, but that's who he reminds me of. So I see some similarities.
George already said no, that's not for me.
Yeah, right. That's it. Yeah, he just crossed it right off the list. So to me, it kind of sounds a little bit like early Tab Morose, like Sender of Thoughts, Tab Morose, mixed with like a little, maybe a little Threshold or Fate's Warning. It's just very different album, and they took all these different elements and they put it together in a unique way.
I tell you, I sold about almost 3,000 CDs about 5 years ago, just making room. And somehow I missed and left that one and sold it. And that's the only one out of 3,000 that I really regret, because that's an awesome album.
Yeah, it's a great record. It pops up, it pops up like on Discogs. So I don't know whatever happened to those guys if they ever did anything else. But I love I don't listen to a lot of these albums anymore, but this is one that I pull out from time to time, and I really do still enjoy it very much. It's good.
Cool. George.
Well, my next one is derives from a couple of things we already talked about, which is there's no reliable way to hear about these bands. And the fact, like Glenn said, we're chasing that Dream Theater drug. We want something that hits us like that. So I'm going to these record shows, and we saw a magazine there, the old Japanese magazine, Young Guitar. And there's an article in there about Dream Theater bands. These bands sound like Dream Theater. And there's like 20 albums in there. And one of them is this band, Angra, who, again, don't sound like Dream Theater at all, but they incorporate that Dream Theater soloing unison runs kind of aesthetic into a power metal framework. And then they also add a Brazilian edge to it, Brazilian percussion, Brazilian wind instruments. This just hit us hard. Love the vocals, the vocalist. I know some people don't like him. We loved him. We thought he was a huge talent. And just musically, they don't have any other albums that sound exactly like this. They get some heat from their fan base for this one being a little too ornate, but that's why I love it. So this one was huge for me.
All time great.
Yep.
Next one, like we were saying, the 80s, no one calls anything progressive metal, and there's no coalesced scene. So if you grew up with Rush and Yes, and you like virtuosic playing, kind of looking around for something. And one of the things that I found back then was the Shrapnel stuff, the Guitar Hero albums. So continuing to follow that label later on in the 90s, they finally take a shot at doing some vocal bands. And this one I loved. Our Tension,
Yeah.
Phoenix Rising. This is again one of those things where it's like everything just came together. This John West, incredible melodic singer, great tone, huge range. You got shredding guitar player and keyboard player to keyboard player, ridiculously over the top. He's the band leader. He went on to put out a bunch of solo albums for the label too. Musically, it's not that progressive. It's like Rainbow meets it's melodic metal with the progressive element is pretty much the playing, the unison lines, the soloing. They are longer songs, developed songs, like 6 and 7 minute songs, but it's not terribly progressive, but progressive enough that that one always stuck with me.
And we just lost the keyboard player Vitaly Kuprij. Was it earlier this year or late last year, something like that?
Late last year, yeah. Next one is from '97. Obviously, I played drums. And by this time, I'm very into technique kind of players, and I loved Watchtower. So when I heard about Spastic Inc., this was a home run. Production is not good. I'll tell you right now. It's like home production, but the material is so good. Ron Jarzombek is a genius on guitar, and what blew me away on this was Bobby Jarzombek as a drummer. I knew him from Riot, and if you just know him from there, you would never guess that he was capable of this kind of performance. This is ridiculous. This drumming is incredible. Just the two of them. Oh no, Pete Perez is on bass. That's right, from Riot also. And again, who knew that he could play like this? This is crazy stuff. It's basically instrumental Watchtower, but loving Watchtower like I did, and I didn't like the vocals. This was like heaven sent. So strongly recommend instrumental tech metal, Spastic Inc.
If you want to end a party, you put that album on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good choices. All right. I'm also going to go with Evergrey, Solitude, Dominance, Tragedy, everything Glenn said. Yeah, just kind of gothic, progressive power metal, totally amazing vocals, very unique vocals, emotional and big riffs and cool spooky keyboards and whatnot. I think with this album and certainly the one that came right after it, for me, I just fell in love with this band. I like the first album too, but as Ken mentioned, it's kind of like this. That's a real murky, dark, kind of bizarre album, but really cool as well. But it's really with the second album that they kind of really took off for me. So that's one there. Next up, this is a band that kind of morphed out of the demise of a great death metal band. And the band is Control Denied. Fragile Art of Existence is the name of the album. This is their one and only album. So basically, Chuck Schuldiner, guitarist and vocalist from Death, decided to put together a progressive metal band because the last few Death albums were very much in that kind of vein, but just with death metal vocals. And he brought some of the band with him. He's got Steve DiGiorgio on bass and Richard Christie on drums from Death, along with vocalist Tim Aymar and Shannon Ham also on guitar. And it's just really good, melodic, very complex progressive metal, dark. And you could very easily see this as being a Death album if they would have put death metal vocals on it. Really good. It's in it. So if you like those last couple of Death albums, that real progressive direction that they were going in, this is where he was going to take that next. Unfortunately, lost him to brain cancer shortly thereafter, and that was pretty much the end of the band. And my last one for this round is going to be Savatage in the Wake of Magellan. So this is a band I was following from the very beginning with that Sirens album, and it's just always interesting to see them kind of move through their career and kind of change direction here and there. They really started to incorporate more progressive tendencies on their Gutter Ballet album and then the Streets album in the beginning of the 90s. And then you had Dead Winter Dead, and this album, this is just big symphonic metal. It's progressive, it's orchestral. Great vocals from Zach Stevens. John Olive also sings on here as well. You got Al Petrelli and my good friend Chris Caffrey on guitars, and just an incredible album with some great songs on it. Really memorable. And this kind of is where the idea and the album before it to come up with Trans-Siberian Orchestra. It kind of all came from here. But a great, great album. And if you only think of like Savage's earlier, really traditional metal, power metal kind of style, they totally went prog metal for a couple hours, couple albums in the beginning of the 90s. So back to Glenn.
So while you all were fawning all over Cynic, I'm going to introduce you to some real progressive death metal. Edge of Sanity,
Oh,
Crimson.
great, great choice. Yeah.
Where it started for me as far as progressive death metal. Dan Swano, one track, 40 minutes long, concept album. Has McHale doing the even more death vocals and the guitar solos. If this doesn't scream dork heaven, I don't know what does. So this is a must.
And the sequel's pretty damn good too.
It is. And,
on Spotify, that 41-minute song, he gets paid 0.001.
Next choice would be Conception in Your Multitude. So this is the introduction to Roy Khan for me, who is one of the best singers of all time. And I will also want to point out Under a Morning Star, the opening track. That riff is iconic to prog metal. It is the crunchiest thing. It's just absolutely, I mean, it's basically the same as smoke on the water to a regular person. That's how iconic this thing is. You just don't get better crunch than that. So, absolute must. And then the other one, which, you know, this is kind of mandatory as well. Shadow Gallery, Tyranny. Just straight up melodic prog concept, sort of a little bit of, I don't know how you want to say, because it wasn't really tied in that well together. But yeah, I don't even know what to say about it. It's just smooth as silk is what it is. That's how I describe it. Smooth as silk prog metal.
And one of the greatest vocalists ever, Mike Baker. May he rest in peace. Great stuff.
All right. So Pete stole my thunder a little bit.
Sorry, Ken.
My next one, well, that's okay. Sabotage, Dead Winter Dead. So,
I'm glad we got both of them covered.
Yeah, everything Pete said about The Wake of Magellan would apply to Dead Winter Dead. I just like this album better. To me, I didn't know shit about Sabotage really until this album came along. And, it's a concept album about the war in Bosnia, and they spawned this cottage industry with Trans-Siberian Orchestra, came out of really, I think, out of this. And the best way I could describe this album, it's like Dream Theater meets Meatloaf meets Broadway. So, it's this sort of, like almost like Jim Steinman wrote this album, wrote a prog metal album. That's, All right, now we're going to start digging. One of my all-time favorites, Hydrotoxin, Oceans.
Yeah.
Remember this one?
Yeah, I have that.
Oh.
You still have it?
Yeah.
They were a German one-and-done band. And in reviewing my catalog back in 97, I called this the prog metal album of the year. Very Dream Theater influence, a lot of long tracks, lots and lots of keyboard players. The guitarist had a little bit of a John Petrucci fetish. The vocalist, Jody Parchardis, he, in a weird way, he reminded me of Graham Bonnet. And he went on to sing with Human Fortress, more of a power metal thing. Next, this was my Psychotic Waltz pick. I went with Bleeding. And they didn't make any bad albums. And I was having really a hard time deciding between Bleeding and Into the Everflow. And I decided that, for me, I think Bleeding had a little bit more of a melodic element to the music. Into the Everflow, a little more psychedelic, maybe a little more technical. But Bleeding had that, but there was more atmosphere. And I think Buddy's vocals are great. You get some flute on there. It's just a little bit more accessible. And I think if you just say Psychotic Waltz, there are no wrong answers. So there's that. And what are we doing? We're doing one more? No, that was three. So we're going to save. Yeah.
I want to add something to Ken here because, like he said, he used to write all these descriptions in his catalog, and 9 out of 10 of those descriptions were fantastic, and it was great, and I truly appreciated it, and I learned a lot. But then that 10th one came around.
Which one?
The 10th one out of 10 that I just sit there and shake my head like, what the fuck are you thinking when you were listening to this? And Hydrotoxin happens to be one of those. I enjoyed the music, but man, I couldn't get into those vocals at all, Ken. It was so accented. I mean, I get it. You come from the prog rock background where it didn't matter what they sounded like.
Oh yeah, they could be singing
So,
Italian. I don't care.
so I could not handle. So anyway, thank you for the other nine, though.
All right. Well,
Pretty good odds there. Not too bad.
my batting average is pretty good.
Yeah.
But
All right, George, your next three.
My next one comes out of you know, mid to late 90s. People are able to utilize the internet to find a scene for this stuff. I was on one site called Heady Metal. Made some use out of that for a while, but eventually I found my way over to Perpetual Motion. And when I found that forum, 98, the two bands they were talking about a lot, albums they were talking about, was the first Ice Age and this one, Pain of Salvation, 1 Hour by the Concrete Lake. So I grabbed them both. I think that might have been my first Ken order. Um, this album made a big impact. I love the vocals. Production is really good. All the playing is good, but nobody jumps out at you playing wise. It's all about the songs. Really good songs. It's a concept album. That doesn't make a big dent with me, but everybody was all excited about it on the board. Won all these awards that everybody voted on at the end of the year. Still my favorite, but yeah, this made a big impact. It's another surprising shrapnel addition to the list. Aniac Requiem, Space Eternal Void.
Oh.
This is okay. At this time, we've all heard 100 Dream Theater bands, and you start being appreciative of someone that doesn't sound like Dream Theater, and that's this. This is a one-man band. The guy plays everything, sings the whole spiel. It's got the shrapnel type guitar playing, incredible neoclassical shredding guitar playing, but it's got some kind of weird ambient vibe. It's like a lava lamp kind of situation, but over this heavy neo-ish framework, and the playing is just great. It's even the drum machine doesn't ruin it for me. I hate drum machine, but this one's pretty convincing, and just it sounds like no other album in my collection. So that's what stood out to me then and still now. And the last one in this group is along the lines of Spastic Inc. Around this time, you're starting to see a lot more instrumental albums that straddle the fence of prog rock, prog metal with a little jazz fusion. And one of them is On the Verge. This is the debut to the world of Virgil Donati. This is his band in Australia. I'll put it to you simply. If you liked Planet X, then you got to get this, because this is every bit as good as those. And it's exactly the same style. Same kind of players. You got guest spots from a couple Americans. Brett Garza and TJ Helmrich do guest solos on it. Rick Fiorabracci does some guest bass work, but really it's about the Virgil songwriting. If you like the kind of songwriting that Virgil Donati does, this is a must, but you're gonna pay out the ass for it because it's out of print for a long time now.
Just heard that Charlie Hustle has left the building. Pete Rose passed away today.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they just announced. So we looked. Chris Christopherson and Pete Rose basically within like 24 hours of each other.
And Dikembe Mutombo.
They say it comes in threes, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, Maggie Smith also was 2 days ago. So it's
Comes in fours.
Yeah. All right. I'm also going to go with 1 Hour by the Concrete Lake. This was my first from Pain of Salvation. I love it. Like George mentioned, no one really stands out. Maybe Daniel's vocals, but it's just great ensemble stuff here and just chunky, groovy, and very different. I always like Pain of Salvation because they just sounded like a totally different band. They weren't really going for any particular sound or whatnot, but really great stuff there. Threshold, Wounded Land from the UK. Again, kind of going after the Dream Theater sound. This was 1993, so this is a year after Images and Words. But man, the vocalist just knocked me on my ass. Damian Wilson. I fell in love with his vocals right around this time, and he's done so much else between now and then. Really interesting band. They did a lot. It's kind of a picture of the guys really young. They did a lot of like really long songs, but they're their songs were very song based. They were never out to do lots of long, lengthy solos and things like that, but just real good dramatic music, very, very melodic and memorable songs, and one of the moodier of the prog metal bands. But they've been so consistent throughout their career. They had so many different singers. I mean, they just keep constantly changing singers, but really, really good album, very, very memorable. And then let me just go over to the Prezi real quick to get my next one. Sorry, guys. This is never all that smooth. Dun, 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 dun. This app sucks. All right, here we go. Gonna go with Far Off Grace from Van and Plas. So, I really love Glenn's pick as well. I went back and forth between the two of them. I figured someone would pick the other one. They're both, to me, just as good. They're both great. What a great German band. And Andy's vocals are just absolutely superb. I mean, if you like the Dream Theater formula, these guys do it pretty well, although they've added a lot of their own flair on, in more recent times. But all their albums are very, very consistently great. And whether they're doing concept albums or not, and just amazing vocals, amazing guitar and keyboard work, and really, really good songs. I think they should be more well known than they are, but one of the great bands from this era. And they have these two albums that we mentioned today. I think like they have other albums in the 2000s which might even be better, but that's a story for another day. So yeah, that's my pick for this round. And last one from everybody. Glenn, go for it.
Last one. House of Spirits, Turn of the Tide. This was one that we wore the hell out back in the day. It fits squarely between Queensryche's Operation Mindcrime and the elements from Empire, right smack in the middle. Great vocals. Songs were short, compact, song oriented, but just had just enough of a flair that gave it that Queensryche vibe.
Well, that was my number 10, but screw you.
There you go.
I'm gonna pick something else. So I'm gonna go with Payne's Gray, Cadith Decoded. So this may have been the most fucked up prog metal album of the 90s. We sold, oh God, I can't tell you how many hundreds of these we sold. It was a concept album based around H.P. Lovecraft's Dream Quest of Unknown Cadith. It's a blending of symphonic prog rock bands like Camel and Yes, with basically like Dream Theater and Fate's Warning. The album starts out kind of soft and symphonic. There's a lot of flute, and then it just starts getting heavy, shredding guitar, soaring vocals, some like real ball squeezing vocals. Uh, the whole album is just dripping with atmosphere. You're following the protagonist Randolph Carter on his dream quest for Cadith. It's a totally unique album, and they could never follow it up.
And you remember I used to be the webmaster back when we were just trying to learn how to do everything.
You were the webmaster.
I was the webmaster for them.
Yeah, that's right. That's
I actually flew over and stayed with them and watched them rehearse. They not the whole album, but they played probably 75% of the album for me straight through. So it was all.
It was Rainer Schmidt, right? Rainer Schmidt was like the father.
Right, and his son.
And his son was in the band, and he like basically wrote the album, and he tried, but they just couldn't come up with a follow up. So, and by the way, somewhere hiding on a cassette in the house, Glenn, I have Hydrotoxin demos for a second album that was never.
Wow, you can keep them too.
Oh, yeah. All right.
All right, George, your final pick.
My last one's from the end of the decade. 99, I think, is the apex of Dream Theater clones. You had Dolly's Dilemma, you had Dreamscape Very, you had the previously mentioned Far Off Grace. Well, my favorite from that year is Lemur Voice Divided. It's the second album. It's on a Dutch label, so the budget's not as good. The production's a downgrade from the first album, which you don't generally see that. But to me, the songs just shine. Marcel Koenen is one of the geniuses in this genre, I think. which is a shame because I don't think he really participates in it anymore. But this album, great in the Dream Theater formula. The singer's different. The singer's kind of got, I've heard him compared to Sting, and I can't say that that's not incorrect. He's got a little different vibe about him, but across the board, great playing, great songs. Got to get it if you like the Dream Theater formula.
Yeah, it's a great choice.
I remember Marcel played a Power Man, played to like a backing track.
I could just listen to him shred. He's amazing.
And that's what he did. He just stood there and shredded, over his backing track.
We were just happy to see him.
All right, let me get my last choice here. All right, I'm also going to go Shadow Gallery. I was tossed between Glenn's pick and this one, Carved in Stone, which is their second album. I ultimately went with Carved in Stone because that was my first ever Shadow Gallery purchase, and I really like it a lot. And it's got Crystalline Dream, which is one of my favorite tracks on here. I think the one issue I always had with this album is like there's too many of those little filler tracks in between the main ones. I almost wish they would have just given us another regular song and got rid of all those little interludes. But I think it's a great album. It's, man, Mike Baker's vocals are so good, and I love the guitars. It's just a really, really great melodic band, and one of those interesting bands that like you listen to every album and you're thinking, oh, I'm sure these guys go out and tour and play all sorts of shows, and they were never ever a live band. They were basically just a studio creation, which was a real shame. I think didn't Chad and Rob try to get them to play at Nearfest once,
Yes.
and that fell through or something?
Yes.
They were local. They were Pennsylvania guys.
Glenn,
They played at ProgPower once, right? Yeah.
But it wasn't with Mike. It was with the new, I can't remember the new vocalist, but yeah, we did have a headline one night, as a matter of fact.
Great thing. Wow, we finished just on time. Look at that. We got them all in. So let me just throw it out there to everybody watching. If you really enjoyed this kind of trip down memory lane, I'm sure all of us have albums that we did not talk about on this episode. So maybe we could do a part two and do additional choices from the 90s and before we maybe think about going into the 2000s or whatnot. So we'll see. Let us know what you think down in the comments below. And Glenn, we want to thank you for coming on and joining us here. You brought a great perspective, and the whole ProgPower history, I think, is just, you just can't have this conversation without talking about that. Cool. So thanks for watching, everybody. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube all together all the damn time. If you are a prog metal fan and you are listening and collecting during this decade, list your favorite 10 choices, albums from the 90s down in the comments below. If you've never really jumped into the style of music before or anything from this era, I think you have a lot of choices here to go out and investigate and hopefully find one of your new favorite bands and albums. So thanks a lot for joining, everybody. For Glenn, for Ken, and for George, I am Pete. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time here on In the Prog Seat. Take care.